So let me introduce Emil, who is my co-convener. Emil is a high-profile public intellectual, social critic. This is true. The laughter is just an acknowledgement of a cultural truth. Emil's also a philosopher, and obviously with a very original voice. One of the things I would say about Emil that really strikes me is that they are a gracious collaborator and exceptionally generous in recognizing and promoting the work of other scholars. Currently, Emil is at, and I may say this wrong, so correct me, the Inamori, is that right? Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve University, and they are arrestingly productive. The author of many philosophical and public-facing articles and 4 books. The most recent of which is the rich and striking 2024, so very, very recent monograph, very, very interesting, Human Extinction, A History of the Science and Ethics of Annihilation. One of Emil's distinctions as a social critic is that of an early and insightful and fierce critic of effective altruism, long-termism, and related ideologies. And I have to tell only one personal anecdote, because when we started planning this and I was trying to write this introduction, I realized we'd had been in touch much longer than I thought we had. But I do remember being utterly floored on first reading Emil's 2021 Aeon article against long-termism. If you haven't read it, I commend it to you. But I was in an office and I was reading on the couch, and I can remember just feeling floored, and I immediately wrote to them with a kind of undisciplined outpouring of enthusiasm for which I'm glad to know I was forgiven. I was afraid I would never be written back. Who could this slavish fan be? In some of their most recent writings, Emil narrates a decisively important history of a cluster of these ideologies, including in addition to effective altruism and long-termism, also transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, modern cosmism, and rationalism. And one of the reasons I'm spelling them out is that I know we've been using the notion of Tescreal, but it may not be familiar to others, so I'll come back to it in just a minute. One strand of their work is about how these ideologies are interlinked, espoused, elaborated, and promoted by overlapping groups of people working at interrelated institutions. Another strand is about how many of the ideologies are expressions of strains of neo-eugenic thought that emerged in the 1990s, or that I'm thinking of Audra's talk, that resurged with a kind of real vividness in the 1990s, not that they were ever gone, expressions of strains of neo-eugenics that, for all their attempts to distinguish themselves from early 20th century eugenics, retain the racist, xenophobic, ableist, classist, and sexist cast of damaging ideologies of their forebears. A third strand of this same project is dedicated to showing that these damaging ideologies are key drivers of the current rush to build artificial general intelligence, or AGI, one of our big themes, a billionaire, centimillionaire dominated capital-fueled scramble that, among other things, is pulling funds away from AI-related technologies devoted to important social justice-oriented projects. That is one of the themes of Emil's writing. The rush to build AGI is also simultaneously selling itself as necessary for the safety or survival of humanity, while also using the same talk of safety to pour funds into holding off an envisioned AGI apocalypse. Together with Timnit Gebru, an electrical engineer and one of the world's most respected and influential voices on the ethics of AI, and here you see the importance of the distinction between AI safety and the ethics of AI. So together with Timnit Gebru, Emil coined the moniker that we've been using, the Tescreal bundle, for these interwoven ideologies behind the dangerous dash to build AGI. And this year, again with Gebru, Emil co-authored, I really recommend this piece, a monumental and important article on, this is the title, The Tescreal Bundle, Eugenics and the Promise of Utopia Through Artificial Intelligence. The story of Émile's unique insight into the history, development, and institutional homes of the ideologies in the Tescreal bundle is significantly a story about how Emil himself was once a dedicated long-termist who came to recognize harms and dangers of long-termism and related ideologies from the inside. That is the reference of the title of Emil's presentation today. I'm going to read it from Techno-Utopian to Ardent Apostate, Why I Joined the Tescreal Movement and Later Defected. I'm so grateful to Emil for organizing the symposium with me, and I want to hear their story. Welcome, thank you, everything. Yes.
Thank you so much, Alice. I would reciprocate all the kind sentiment. It's been an absolute pleasure to organize this amazing conference. Douglas's talk, Audra's talk were both absolutely fantastic. Also, just drawing a bit from continuing a theme that was foregrounded by Douglas and Audra, I thought I'd mention that there were two French scholars recently who coined this very useful phrase, which is the eternal return of eugenics. And that I feel like that really captures, eugenics really goes back to ancient Roman law. Plato, Aristotle were eugenicists in their own particular way. And it's really a through line that extends from the ancient Greeks all the way to the 21st century. And a lot of people don't understand there's continuity with respect to the eugenics tradition throughout the 20th century. There were many countries that implemented for the first time a eugenics program after the the Nazi occupation. So the Nazis, World War II ended, the Nazis, the regime was toppled, and then subsequently in the later decades, second half of the 20th century, they implemented eugenics program. So this idea just won't die, and I think now it manifests in the race to build AGI and this bundle of ideologies that I've called the Tescreal bundle. Okay, so. That being said, thank you, Alice. Sorry, didn't give you a chance to exit the stage. So I thought I would start with a question, which is before Douglas's talk yesterday, which mentioned the Tescreal acronym, how many people had heard of that term before? So I know there's some people for sure. Okay, so many people, but not all. Of those individuals who had heard of this term, this neologism, how many are familiar with at least one of the ideologies, to the point that if they were asked to define the ideology, they could give a succinct, accurate definition? Okay, so a fair number. Okay, so third of four questions, how many individuals were once a part, a member, a participant of the corresponding movements? Transhumanism, Longtermism, and so on. So kind of Douglas. We were both affiliated with the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies for a while, back in I think I was there around 2010 or so. And they published a journal, academic journal, which was called the Journal of Evolution Technology, originally titled the Journal of Transhumanism. I published in it some really seminal works by Nick Bostrom, who I'll be mentioning, were published there as well. Okay, so the last question is how many people within this subgroup regret their participation in these movements? So maybe this is just for, so I'll raise my hand, and maybe Douglas as well.
I think it's more they are unhappy about having associated with me.
Yes, very much. Same here. Same here. Yes. All right, this is now working. Good. So yes, I'm at Case Western Reserve University, recovering Tescrealist. This talk will be much more autobiographical than any previous talk I've given, and I think there are two reasons that I point to justify foregrounding my own personal intellectual journey into these movements and then out of them. The first one is that the reasons that I became a very active participant of the Tescreal movement, and then later left and became very vocally critical of the movement, touch upon a number of important issues relating to the appeal of these ideologies and their potential dangers. And second, many people over the past few years have just asked me about this. How in the hell did I get involved, and why did I end up leaving? And I should say that there are lots of people in these communities who are very critical of effective altruism and long-termism, but there's an enormous amount of self-censorship because there is a huge amount of money behind these ideologies. Billions, literally tens of billions of dollars. Before FTX collapsed in November, was it November? I think November 2022. The effective altruist community as a whole had a committed funding of $46.1 billion. They lost a little bit of that as a result of Sam Bankman-Fried getting caught for committing massive amounts of fraud, but they still had just huge amounts of money, and other people, Dustin Moskovitz, co-founder of Facebook, is a major funder of the community. So there's just an enormous amount of money, and I understand that the academic job market is terrible. So there are many people in this community who privately send me emails and say, I completely agree with your criticisms, but they don't publicly state that because they work for some of these organizations, obviously don't want to lose their job. So here's some background. I grew up in a very religious community, mostly Baptist, but other denominations as well. Since the 1970s, a particular interpretation of the Bible has become highly influential within evangelical circles. This is called dispensationalism. And I should say 1970s. So what changed in the 1970s? This book by Hal Lindsey was published, The Late Great Planet Earth. And that was by far the biggest best-selling, quote-unquote, nonfiction book of the decade. And it propelled the dispensationalist interpretation of Scripture into the public consciousness and really changed the religious landscape of the US since then. Though most people, including evangelicals, are unfamiliar with this term dispensationalism, most are probably familiar with the rapture. The idea of the rapture was introduced in the 1830s by the dispensationalist interpretation of eschatology, or literally the study of last things. So this is the face of a guy named John Nelson Darby, and he was the pioneer of the dispensationalist interpretation. It was this dispensationalist view of Scripture that introduced the idea of the rapture. It was an innovation, eschatological innovation, if you will. So, and again, it was this innovation that was popularized by Hal Lindsey in the 1970s. And now most people have probably heard of the rapture. In my community, there was constant talk of the rapture happening at any moment. This is when Jesus will swoop down and gather up all believers since 70 AD, when the Second Temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. The tribulation will then commence. That's a 7-year period of extreme awfulness and massive suffering as the Antichrist gains global power, culminating in the Battle of Armageddon at the very end of the tribulation between Jesus and the Antichrist. This last sentence we will return to later on when we talk about Tescrealism. If you're alive when the rapture happens, then lucky for you, you get to live forever without ever having died. Okay, so I have vivid memories of standing in my basement around, as I recall, it was 9 p.m. on November 3rd, 1992, hearing the announcement that Bill Clinton had just won the presidential election. That is significant because I was overcome with fear, because everybody around me was convinced that Clinton was the Antichrist. If true, that means the rapture really is imminent. Things are happening. The world as we know it is about to end. I found all of this really, really scary. Being trapped and feeling helpless amid this horrifying cosmic battle between good and evil. And I also worried that God might examine my heart and decide that I didn't believe in Jesus enough to be saved. So there's a lot of anxiety associated with that. By the early 2000s, I had largely apostatized my faith in Christianity. This conviction that Christianity is in fact false was further reinforced by the new atheist movement that emerged after the 9/11 terrorist attacks here in New York City. Perhaps some of you remember the new atheist movement. For a while, it was like really cool. But later on, once again, I defected and became very critical of new atheism because it kind of slid into the far right. So, however, around this time, 2005 or so, I stumbled upon transhumanism through the work of Ray Kurzweil, specifically his 2005 book, The Singularity is Near. As it happens, I was a research assistant for Kurzweil's more recent follow-up to this book, The Singularity is Nearer. So, just, yeah, for whatever that's worth. So this led me to Nick Bostrom's articles on transhumanism and existential risk. And there's a picture of Kurzweil, of course, with what might be called his suspenders of disbelief. At first, I was highly critical of transhumanism and singularitarianism, this idea of the coming technological singularity, which will constitute a fundamental rupture in the fabric of human history. Kurzweil, Bostrom, and others in the community acknowledged that the probability of total human annihilation this century is unprecedentedly high, due almost entirely to the very emerging technologies they saw as necessary to create a new post-human species. So, for example, in his 1999 book, Age of Spiritual Machines, Kurzweil writes, quote, "How likely are these dangers? My own view is that a planet approaching its pivotal century of computational growth, as the Earth is today, has a better than even chance of making it through. But then I have always been accused of being an optimist." So that's pretty dire. Obviously, if you got on a plane and you ask the pilot what's the probability that it's going to crash, it's better than even. You can get off. You get a deplane. So that was very alarming to me. Bostrom writes in 2002 in his influential article on existential risk, "My subjective opinion is that setting this probability probability of existential catastrophe lower than 25% would be misguided, and the best estimate may be considerably higher." In 2005, during his TED Talk, he argued that there's at least a 20% chance of extinction in particular. So again, that's before 2100. So that's 70 plus years from now. Lord Martin Rees wrote in 2003's book, Our Final Hour, that there's a 50-50 chance of civilizational collapse before 2100, and so on and so on. So I became familiar with all of these, quite ominous warnings about the dangers associated with the development of emerging technologies, and my thoughts aligned with Bill Joy's position. If any of you are familiar with this quite fascinating article published in 2000, as it happens April 1st, 2000, in Wired magazine by Bill Joy, co-founder of Sun Microsystems, where he argued that these technologies are so dangerous that we should implement a kind of broad relinquishment regime to prevent the development of certain emerging technology, genetics technologies, nanotechnology, and advanced robotics, GNR technologies. And so I was very sympathetic with his view. These technologies are so dangerous. Why are we considering developing them? Well, for Kurzweil and the others, we have to develop them because they are our vehicle to reach a utopian future. So by definition, a failure to develop these technologies would itself be existentially catastrophic. There's only one way forward on their view. So at this point, the view that I was most sympathetic to was, as it is called, anarcho-primitivism. So this is the idea that we should relinquish all these advanced technologies and return to smaller communities that survive through hunting, gathering, and fishing. The famous slogan is "back to the Pleistocene." So this was sort of my view. I'm reading these transhumanists going, gosh, this just sounds like such an absolutely awful, obviously foolish idea. So the more I read about transhumanism, singularitarianism, and related ideologies like extropianism, which was the first organized modern transhumanist movement from the late 1980s, early 1990s, the more convinced I became that the enterprise of scientific and technological development is unstoppable. As Kurzweil repeatedly declares in The Singularity is Near, the singularity is inevitable. or as Bostrom conjectures, all technological capabilities that could be realized will eventually be realized. That's his technological completion conjecture. All right, so you can, this sort of is a graphic illustration of the supposed inevitability of technological change. It's change is occurring. The technology is being developed at exponential rate. We are somewhere like up here. How really is it? Is there any realistic chance of causing that curve to bend to the right? Sorry. It doesn't seem like there is any realistic possibility there. So in 2009, I published an article in the Journal of Evolution and Technology. Again, that was being published by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, where Douglas and I were both affiliated, in which I present an argument for embracing transhumanism based on the inevitability of humans and machines merging. If you can't beat them, then join them. So I became a transhumanist. However, something very curious happened. It began to dawn on me that transhumanism and these related ideologies offer exactly what traditional religion itself offers: the promise of paradise, immortality, the abolition of suffering, perfect happiness, and so on. It even has its own form of resurrection. If one doesn't live long enough to live forever, as Ray Kurzweil puts it, then one could opt to have their body, or just their head and neck, cryogenically frozen so that it can be reanimated once the technology becomes available in the future. A lot of people in this community have signed up with cryonics companies like Alcor. So I was at a workshop, for example, back in 2017 in Sweden, and I was surrounded by a bunch of notable figures in the community. Andrew Sandberg was there, for example. Audra Mitchell mentioned Robin Hanson, who Slate described as the creepiest economist in America. I didn't really know that about him at the time, but he's a kind of major thinker within the Tescreal movement. And he was there, and I noticed that a lot of them were wearing dog tags. And I asked someone what the dog tag meant, and it was, in case I die. It's instructions for me to be shipped out, my body to be treated a certain way, and then to be flown out to California as soon as possible to be cryogenically frozen. So, yes. So hence, paradise, on this view, is something that we could create in this world rather than the other world, in this life rather than the afterlife, through our own scientific and technological ingenuity. By becoming post-human and spreading into the accessible universe within our future light cone, we could establish heaven in the literal heavens. Bostrom and others, such as David Pearce, a very influential transhumanist thinker, refer to this literally as paradise engineering. So there's a question: are the similarities between transhumanism and traditional religion just a coincidence? Actually, no. The ideology of transhumanism was explicitly developed as a secular replacement for Christianity. So what happened, in brief, was that 19th century the prevalence of religious belief among the educated classes, quote unquote, fell precipitously. So it was, in fact, this century where Karl Marx, some would say, denigrated religion as the opium of the people, and Friedrich Nietzsche declared, borrowing an idea from his contemporary, Philip Mainlander, that God is dead. Is the microphone cutting in and out at all?
Not much. It did once. Yeah, just a little bit. But.
Okay, if it does again, let me know, and I'll switch mics. Consequently, as a result of the waning of religious belief in the Western world during the 19th century, a crucial source of meaning, purpose, and eschatological hope suddenly vanished. This led to a flurry of new secular ideologies, complete with their own eschatological visions of humanity's collective future in the universe, to fill in this gap. So one might argue, as some have, that Marxism might be an example of this. A secular ideology has a kind of utopian vision of the future. Marx himself didn't say a whole lot about what exactly utopia would look like, but that was a part of the kind of eschatology of it. Yeah, plenty of other examples. You could see this in latter 19th century German philosophy. I mentioned Philip Mainlander, so he would be an example. A bunch of these atheists, following in the tradition, the atheistic tradition of Arthur Schopenhauer, were proposing these grand visions of the future of humanity, which they were explicit in their hope that these visions, these systems, would provide a sense of meaning, purpose, and hope for the future. So transhumanism was an example here. And so going back to this slide, you've got the 1927 book by Julian Huxley, a leading eugenicist, as it happens, the president of the British Eugenics Society from 1969 to 1972. And his book, he did not use the word transhumanism in this book, but he did develop the idea. I believe he called it evolutionary humanism. But the book is revealingly titled Religion Without Revelation. So, if you fast forward to the modern transhumanist era from the 1990s on, you've got Ray Kurzweil, who's writing in 2005, yes, well, we need a new religion, in a fictional exchange with Bill Gates. Bill Gates says, we need to get away from the ornate and strange stories in contemporary religions and concentrate on some simple messages. We need a charismatic leader for this new religion. Ray Kurzweil says, a charismatic leader is part of the old model. That's something we want to get away from. Bill says, okay, a charismatic computer then. Ray says, how about a charismatic operating system? Bill says, we've already got that. So is there a God in this religion? And Ray says, not yet, but there will be. Once we saturate the matter and energy in the universe with intelligence, it will, quote unquote, wake up, be conscious and sublimely intelligent. That's about as close to God as I can imagine. And we'll return to that notion of God in just a moment. So in fact, some have referred to the technological singularity as the techno-rapture, or the rapture of the nerds. Here, Bostrom writes in 2003 in the Transhumanist FAQ, which was actually co-authored by a large number of people in the community. While not a religion, transhumanism might serve a few of the same functions that people have traditionally sought in religion. It offers a sense of direction and purpose and suggests a vision that humans can achieve something greater than our present condition, and so on and so on. So from this new religion perspective, one can understand the ongoing push to build AGI as follows. If God doesn't exist, then why not just create him? So this also ties into, you've all know Harari's book, Homo Deus. And Douglas had mentioned as well this line, I think it was from Stuart Brand, we must become as gods, something like that. So here's some examples. Thinking about AI as God. If God doesn't exist, then let's just create a super intelligent system that will function as a kind of supernatural being relative to us. Sam Harris in this TED Talk says we have to admit that we're in the process of building some sort of God. Here's ChatGPT. Sorry, is it Gemini, the Google results? So, and also, this is a leading figure within the AI safety community, where AI safety is a field that directly emerged out of the Tescreal movement. And so Connor Leahy has become a notable figure in this field, and he refers to the development of safe AGI, or safe superintelligence, as divinity engineering. But also, as with traditional religion, utopian promises are paired with apocalyptic warnings, apocalyptic possibilities. So AGI will either be a god that gives us everything we've ever wanted, including immortality. Hence, if you're alive when the techno-rapture happens, and if the AGI that catalyzes the techno-rapture is so-called value aligned, then hooray, you get to live forever without ever having died. Or AGI will be a demon that annihilates humanity, and along with it, the glorious transhuman, quoting Eliezer Yudkowsky and many others in the community, this glorious transhuman future that we could have otherwise created. Hence, Elon Musk warns that with AGI, which he very much wants to build, that's why he founded XAI, we are summoning the demon. So there is this utopian and this apocalyptic potentiality that is sort of bound up together. So at this point, in the 2009, 2010, I was wondering if I perhaps had found kind of what I was looking for. Transhumanists seemed to perfectly fit the religion-shaped hole left behind when I abandoned Christianity in the early 2000s. And the other thing I would say here is that, yeah, the idea was that transhumanism, singularitarianism, and so on, I mean, these are supposed to be, they serve the same functions as religion. They provide that hope, that sense of meaning, the possibility of immortality, but they are supposedly founded on reason, science, evidence, rationality, and so on, not faith and revelation. So it seemed to be a perfect combination of everything one might want. Again, the promise of immortality and so on, but paired, or at least founded on a much more robust epistemological foundation. So for some people like me, there is, or at least can be, a certain powerful seduction to big numbers and grand visions of the future. We're talking about utopia, a world marked by astronomical amounts of value, containing trillions and trillions of future people living post-human lives so wondrous that we cannot even begin to imagine what they are like. As Lord Martin Rees wrote in the foreword of a book that I published on existential risk in 2017, he says, the stakes are so high, utopia, astronomical value, that those involved in this effort of reducing existential risk will have earned their keep, even if they reduce the probability of a catastrophe by a tiny fraction. In other words, working on existential risk reduction, ensuring that the apocalypse, quote unquote, doesn't happen is very, very, very important. What exactly could possibly be more important than this? That gave, and I think still gives, a lot of people who are working on this topic a profound sense of, a kind of messianic sense of self-importance. Like, what are we doing? We're literally trying to save not just present-day humanity, and there I would, I don't know where Audrey is, but I would problematize the term humanity, because I don't think that means everyone on Earth. But we're not only trying to save humanity today, but there are just vast numbers of future people who could exist. But if we go extinct, if existential catastrophe were to happen, these unborn people, digital unborn, would remain forever unborn. I've said before during podcasts that one possible slogan for long-termism is, won't someone think of the digital unborn? Right? Because there's just so many of them, and that's precisely what makes the future so important. It's not that future people matter more than present people. It's a numbers game. There's just so many more of them in the future, potentially, than there are at present. So all of this was great. I was really excited that I had discovered these communities. I was working on existential risk. I began publishing on this topic from the late 2000s until around 2018, 2019. The primary focus of my research was existential risk prevention. And just to be clear, existential risk is any event that would prevent us from creating this techno-utopian world among the heavens, full of astronomical amounts of value. And so there was a recent survey out that listed me, that's my old name when I went by Phil, as the 6th most prolific contributor to the existential risk literature. So I have a kind of street cred. And indeed, I went to like a bunch of EA conferences. So I don't know if you can find me in this picture. I will zoom in here. I'm on the left. And if you look just a little bit closer, so you can see me in the shirt here. And if you look just a little bit closer, there's William McCaskill. So I was passionate. I was enamored by this vision of the future, and I ended up giving a talk at the Future of Humanity Institute, which was founded by Bostrom in 2005. Shared office space with Andrew Sandberg, who's a very well-known figure within the field. I spent several months in 2019 as a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. But it was in 2018, 2019 that my thinking began to shift. There were 3 main reasons for this. First, in late 2018, I started to work on a book about the ethical and evaluative implications of human extinction, which ultimately became part 2 of my most recent book on human extinction. One view on this topic comes from Longtermism, of course, which draws heavily from totalist utilitarianism, ethical theory called totalist utilitarianism, according to which We must maximize the total amount of intrinsic value, by which utilitarians mean well-being or welfare, within the universe as a whole, both synchronically at the present moment, but also diachronically across time. The more I reflected on the underlying philosophical arguments for long-termism, the weaker those arguments appeared. So, for example, according to long-termism, persons, you and I, have no intrinsic value. That's because well-being is the only intrinsically valuable thing in the entire universe. Rather, you and I, persons, have merely instrumental value as the means by which intrinsic value is realized. We are, in other words, the containers or the vessels or the vehicles or the substrate of value, a point made famous by John Rawls in his theory of justice. So there are two ways to maximize intrinsic value within the universe, bracketing some nuances and complications and qualifications and so on. One is to increase the total amount of well-being among those who currently exist, thereby increasing the average amount of value that each container person contains. Right, that makes sense? The other is just to create new containers. So on the one hand, you could just say like, okay, here are the containers that currently exist. Let's try to fill them with as much value or happiness or well-being or whatever as possible. Another possibility, another way to maximize total amount of value is just to add new containers to the population. Insofar as those new containers themselves contain, on average, net positive amounts of value, then you will have succeeded in increasing the total amount of value in the universe. That means that on this totalist utilitarian view, could exist implies should exist on the assumption that the person who could exist will contain the net positive amounts of value. That means that we should create as many future people as possible. Bigger is better, as McCaskill writes in his 2022 book, What We Owe the Future. So I hope that makes sense. From a synchronic perspective, that means, yes, we should increase the human population. Along the diachronic perspective, it means the more people who exist in the future, the better the universe becomes as a whole. And that implies that any catastrophe that prevents us from creating those future people would be bad, not just because of the harms it would cause contemporary individuals, but because it would preclude the realization of the potentially vast number of future people. And in fact, that is on the long-termist, in general, the Tescrealist view, the loss of those future people is by far the worst aspect of human extinction. It's not that 8 billion people might die horrendous deaths, next year or something. It is again, won't someone think of the digital unborn? It's all of those unborn people remaining unborn. All of that potential value being locked up as a mere potentiality and never as in actuality. That is the biggest catastrophe of human extinction. So indeed, this is why long-termists are obsessed with calculating how many hypothetical future digital people there could be. On one count, 10 to the 38 digital people per century within our local supercluster of galaxies, the Virgo supercluster, 10 to the 45 people per century in the Milky Way galaxy, according to Toby Newberry, and 10 to the 58 digital people in the universe as a whole, according to Bostrom in his 2014 book, Superintelligence. And you might wonder, why digital people? Well, the idea is that you can cram more digital people per volumetric unit of space than you can biological beings. Imagine if we go out, first of all, colonizing the universe as biological beings might be really, really difficult because space is incredibly hostile. There's space radiation, there's microgravity, there's the psychological difficulties of being stuck in a spacecraft for maybe centuries or millions of years, traveling to distant galaxies and so on. And so, on the one hand, just colonizing, spreading beyond our solar system might be incredibly difficult as biological beings. But you can imagine once we get to these destinations, these distant galaxies, if we then go on to terraform exoplanets, there's only so many biological beings you could fit on those planets. Well, instead, alternatively, if you get there and use advanced technologies to convert those exoplanets into computronium, so it's this theoretical form of matter that is optimized to perform computations. So this is taken seriously. The idea is we would then convert these exoplanets into computronium and then run virtual reality worlds. You could have an enormous, orders of magnitude more people who would be digital living in these simulated worlds than in those worlds than biological people living on the terraformed version of that planet. Does that make sense? I hope so. So that is why digital people is really important. Becoming digital, uploading our minds, or figuring out how to create some kind of AGI that is sentient in at least to the extent that we are. Okay. But is this right? Is this the correct way to think about persons? Isn't all of this, in a way, reducing morality to a branch of economics whereby our moral obligations arise from mere number crunching, abstract and alienating as that is, whereby people are treated as fungible units, as nothing more than a means to an end? So, obviously, you got the Immanuel Kant down here saying we should never be treated as mere means. And then, I started reading criticisms of these ideas, and there was a 1978 article by Jonathan Bennett, which is quite good, in which he says, he is critiquing the totalist utilitarian view, and he writes, as well as deploring a situation where a person lacks happiness, that would be the container that could be filled with more happiness but isn't. These philosophers, utilitarians, also deplore a situation where some happiness lacks a person, and they speak of the latter situation as being one in which some utility is lost. This, I submit, is a philosophical mistake. So that is entirely consistent with this idea that there are all of these future people, hypothetical possible people in the future, and there is an enormous amount of happiness that's looking for a person, namely those people. So if we fail to bring those people into existence, all of that happiness will remain a mere potentiality, and that would be catastrophic. That would be a loss, as Jonathan Bennett writes here. So if some of this doesn't make sense, then maybe you're completely getting it. Right. Okay. So if one includes merely hypothetical future digital people, millions, billions, or trillions of years from now, in one's expected value calculation, then the far future wins every time. Again, we're talking about 10 to the 45 digital people in the Milky Way galaxy per century, 10 to the 58 within our future light cone as a whole, according to Nick Bostrom. Put differently, if one is an effective altruist who is committed to the idea of positively influencing the greatest number of people, and if most people who could exist will exist in the far future, then one should be focused on them rather than current day people. Or rather, one should be focused on current day people only insofar as it's relevant to positively influencing those far future individuals. So this yields two possible dangers. One is it minimizes, maybe I could have introduced the second reason, which is the extremism, and these are the premises to my claim here. On the one hand, this way of thinking about the future and of thinking about ethics minimizes, or at least inclines believers to minimize or trivialize all contemporary problems that don't threaten our long-term future in the universe, so-called non-existential catastrophes. As Bostrom writes in 2002, about the worst atrocities and disasters of the 20th century, so this would be the World War II, the AIDS pandemic that's killed, tens of millions of people. He mentions the Chernobyl disaster. He has just this long list of disasters and atrocities. Tragic as such events are to the people immediately affected in the big picture of things, from the cosmic perspective of humanity, humankind as a whole, even the worst of these catastrophes are mere ripples on the surface of the great sea of life. They haven't significantly affected the total amount of human suffering or happiness or determined the long-term fate of our species. So chill out a little bit about them. take a broader cosmic perspective and understand that these are just little hiccups. These are just little blips. And there are bigger things to worry about, such as existential catastrophes, which by definition would erase this entire quote-unquote vast and glorious future before we have a chance to actually draw it. So the second, so on the one hand, there's the trivialization, the minimization of contemporary problems. On the other hand, the long-termist ideology could incline people to engage in extreme measures, perhaps even violence, to protect and preserve, I just mentioned this phrase, our vast and glorious future among the heavens, quoting Toby Ord in his 2020 book, The Precipice. So is this plausible? In the years leading up to 2019, I spent a lot of time reading about apocalyptic terrorism, relevant to my work on so-called agential risk. one thing stood out to me: any ideology that combines a utopian vision of the future marked by infinite or astronomical amounts of value, and b, a broadly utilitarian ends can justify the means mode of moral reasoning, has all the ingredients necessary to quote-unquote justify violence in the minds of true believers for the sake of utopia. If the ends can at least sometimes justify the means, and the means are, and the ends are a literal utopia in which everyone lives forever and is perfectly happy, then what exactly is off the table for realizing this end? And it's worth emphasizing here that there is a long, long history of movements that, in many cases, began as explicitly peaceful, but were utopian, and ultimately led to violent conflicts. Again, there is a kind of utilitarian logic, one could argue, built into utopianism. If you can see utopia looming on the horizon, right in front of you, and there's a million individuals in between you and utopia, it might seem like a morally acceptable, morally permissible thing, or perhaps a morally obligatory act to slaughter the million people in order to get utopia. After all, the value of utopia is infinite, or at least astronomical. So hence, that enormous amount of value could be seen as a way of justifying violence in the present. Yeah, okay, I don't mean to belabor that point. So this got me really worried, and in 2019, it was the first time, late 2019, I posted on social media that I became nervous about the possibility of long-termism justifying violence, because both A and B, utopianism and utilitarianism, are right there at the very core of the long-termist ideology. Yes, so here, 2019, I wrote, I'm increasingly convinced that the EA long-termist ideologies could be at least one of the most dangerous views on the contemporary marketplace of ideas. I worry that if widely accepted, this result would be catastrophic. So I was almost immediately ostracized from the community. It was fine with me. Although it was also sad. I lost a lot of friends. And I think this is yet another way that long-term is kind of similar to a religious cult. They are very intolerant of criticisms, or more specifically, they like the criticisms that they like. The criticism that they don't like, they want nothing to do with, and you will be banished from their community if you articulate those criticisms. So a year and a half later, I published the Ian article that Alice had mentioned, titled Against Long-Termism, which outlined these worries in some detail. If taken literally, long-termism could justify extreme measures or even violence for the sake of utopia. At the time, these worries were merely hypothetical. And they were specifically directed at the ideology itself. So I was not claiming that there are individuals in this community who are saying, maybe like, hush hush, like behind the scenes, maybe violence is okay. I wasn't familiar with any example of that. But the worry was that at the core of the ideology, the problem lies at the core of the ideology itself. These days, it's not so hypothetical. So for example, last year, in the pages of Time magazine, Elias Yudkowsky, who's a major figure who has direct connections with every single letter in the Tescreal acronym, he calls for states to engage in targeted military strikes to prevent an existential catastrophe from AGI, even at the risk of triggering a massive thermonuclear war. Why is that? Because a thermonuclear war probably won't be existentially catastrophic, which appears to be true. The most up-to-date studies, there was one from 2019 that determined an all-out thermonuclear exchange between the US and Russia would kill about 5 billion people. So that leaves a reassuring 3 billion individuals to carry on civilization. That's not an existential catastrophe. It would be bad, but again, if you take this grand cosmic perspective, that's just a little hiccup. On the other hand, Yudkowsky thinks that misaligned AGI would be. So he thinks that if we build AGI in the near future, it will be misaligned. And if it's misaligned, it will not be the God that we want, that gives everything we ask, everything it can to its parents rather than children. But rather, it'll be a demon that by default annihilates humanity. So we're not ready for AGI. And hence, risking thermonuclear war is worth it to preserve the far future. So indeed, he was asked on Twitter the question, quote, how many people are allowed to die to prevent AGI? And in brackets, there should be it's some extra information there, which is in the relative near future. Because he is very much explicitly in favor of building AGI, just not yet. And his response is that there should be enough survivors on Earth in close contact to form a viable reproductive population with room to spare, and they should have a sustainable food supply. So long as that's true, there's still a chance of reaching the stars someday. So as long as we don't dip below the minimum viable population and the individuals who remain are geographically proximate enough to carry on humanity, then thermonuclear war would be worth it if it means that we still have a chance of reaching the stars someday. Furthermore, other examples of how the long-termist ideology could end up justifying extreme measures comes from the meeting minutes of an AI safety workshop held in Berkeley hosted by a number of individuals who are part of the EA community, who have affiliations with Open Philanthropy. One of them went on to work for Eliezer Yudkowsky's organization, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, or MIRI. And so they held this AI safety. Again, AI safety emerged directly out of the Tescreal movement. And in the meeting minutes, they were talking about, so a lot of these people are doomers like Yudkowsky. They want AGI, they just don't think we're ready yet. And so they're brainstorming strategies for preventing AGI from being built in the near future, for delaying the creation of the first AGI. And under the heading, produce aligned AI before unaligned AI kills everyone, the meeting minutes indicate that some suggested the following. Solution, be Ted Kaczynski. Later on, someone proposed the strategy of start building bombs from your cabin in Montana, where Kaczynski, of course, conducted his campaign of domestic terrorism, and mail them to DeepMind and OpenAI LOL. This was followed a few sentences later by strategy, we kill all AI researchers. So my view, at least, is that this attitude makes sense within the long-termist framework. I mean, these individuals would say that assassinating someone, killing someone, is bad. But allowing them to develop AI, which is going to result in existential catastrophe and consequently the non-existence, the non-realization of vast amounts of future value, that is so much worse. So I think that this is a ticking time bomb. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's no violence perpetrated by these individuals, but I worry that it's just a matter of time before they find themselves in what might be described as an apocalyptic moment where they feel like they're justified to protect and preserve our vast and glorious future, namely Techno-Utopia, through some kind of violent means. Again, there is enormous historical precedence for this. Movements that started off as explicitly peaceful. You might have heard of the Japanese terrorist group Aum Shinrikyo. You know, they perpetrated the 1995 Tokyo subway sarin attack, which killed a bunch of people, sickened a whole bunch of others. They were apocalyptic, utopian, and they started off as explicitly peaceful, never do harm to anyone else. And over time, they just came to believe that we're in this apocalyptic moment. This is a do or die moment. It's crunch time. And that is what led them to engage in violence. So at the core of long-termism, of the Tescreal ideologies, I think are these ingredients that are sufficient to lead someone to this line of reasoning. So in mid-2022, then, I began writing a series of critiques of long-termism popular media websites. This was in response to McCaskill releasing his aforementioned book, What We Owe the Future, in the summer of 2022. Not long after, I started being harassed online. Again, this sort of gets at the like utilitarian, like ends justify the means kind of danger of these ideologies. There were cases of threats of like physical violence. Some of these were just like pretty hilarious. Like this fake account, which has me as a professor at CSER, where I was a visiting scholar for a while. And that is almost certainly an AI manipulated image of my profile, because I had a gray beanie on in the photo at the time. So I don't know, I find that to be kind of funny, but also a little disturbing. And yeah, I won't go into detail about this, but also there was for example, emails referencing this short film call this as vanity about a murder-suicide, and then the person saying, I hope something less extreme than what happens in the film is necessary to make you look at the kind of person you're becoming. So this is the EA community. This is a community that I was a part of. So moving on now to the third reason. Dystopianism. This is by far the most embarrassing reason for having left the transhumanist EA long-termist movement. I started to actually read the work of scholars who aren't white men. This is an image from 2017, I believe, conference on AI safety hosted by the Future of Life Institute. It's become somewhat famous for the obvious reason that it's all men, mostly white men. Sam Harris, Demis Hassabis, co-founder of Google DeepMind, Nick Bostrom, Ray Kurzweil over there, and at the very end, of course, Elon Musk, our favorite billionaire. And Max Tegmark, cosmologist at MIT, who co-founded the Future of Life Institute. So I discovered that obviously there's just vast diversity of different views on what our collective future could and, more importantly, should look like. But these perspectives are systematically suppressed, ignored, neglected within the long-termist literature. Indeed, one of the most striking features of this literature is that there's virtually zero discussion about the possible, probable, and preferable futures from the perspectives of, say, feminism, queerness, disability, indigeneity, Islam, and various other non-Western cultural, religious, and intellectual traditions. I think Audra had mentioned briefly that there are the occasional references to non-Western views, but they're just, it's so exploitative. They just like pluck out these ideas and then use them to further support their own particular, the view that they want to advocate. And it's not a serious reflection on the possibility that there are ways that the future could turn out that are different than what the long-termists want, but perhaps also desirable. I could have articulated that better, but yeah, so no serious discussion about these alternative perspectives of the future. So here I would say I have scholars like Ruha Benjamin, Audra Mitchell, Aditya Chaudhuri, and many others to thank for shaking me out of my dogmatic whiteness, or whatever the better term would be. So Ruha Benjamin, for example, I gave a talk at Princeton back in, I think it was 2018, and it was 3 individuals for the afternoon. It was Peter Diamandis, who is a leading figure within the Tescreal movement. He co-founded the Singularity University with Ray Kurzweil. And then it was Ruha Benjamin, and then it was me. And at the time, I was very, ideologically at least, was much more aligned with Peter Diamandis. But the contrast between her talk about these concrete harms and the exciting, insightful way she presented this idea of alternative, pluralistic futures contrasted so starkly with Peter Diamandis's just like unsophisticated techno-optimism, really left an indelible impact on me. And just recently I exchanged an email with her where I mentioned this to her, and she was very, very happy that she had played some part in me changing my views. But also, Audra Mitchell's co-authored article with Aditya Chaudhuri was published in 2020 on how a lot of the discourse about the end of the world really is discourse about the end of whiteness, just further reinforced my emerging conviction that the long-termist worldview, the Techno-Utopianism at its heart, is just deeply, deeply misguided. So yes, this Techno-Utopian vision is really just techno-capitalism on steroids. And they reflect, these visions reflect all of the privilege and entitlement of the white men at elite universities like Oxford and Silicon Valley, who are the authors of this vision, who crafted them. And here I would recommend Alexander Thomas's really excellent just published book, which I was delighted to write a glowing blurb for, and Alex will be talking later today. So it became clear to me that if long-termists were to succeed in creating their utopia, marginalized communities would become marginalized even more, if not entirely eliminated. Even more, it's not just marginalized communities. It's not clear that our species itself would have a place in the world that these long-termists and transhumanists and so on hope to create in the near future, this century. We often associate pro-extinctionist views, for lack of a better term, with things like philosophical pessimism. Life is not worth living. Non-existence is preferable to existence. Everything is terrible. Think of Arthur Schopenhauer and so on, as well as radical environmentalism. Homo Shiticus, that's a term that comes from the Earth First journal, which has stated my memory. Homo Shiticus is destroying the biosphere. Therefore, we should destroy Homo Shiticus. So oftentimes we associate these pro-extinctionist perspectives with ideas like this, philosophical pessimism and radical environmentalism. But long-termism and so on itself should be seen, I argue, as a particularly insidious form of pro-extinctionism, since long-termists are either indifferent about our extinction or positively hope to bring it about once post-humanity appears on the scene. Here's a recent example published a few years ago by Derek Schiller, somebody who's in the EA long-termist community, and he is quite explicit. If it's possible for us to create artificially intelligent progeny whose lives could be filled with more pleasure and joy than our lives, we ought to bring about our extinction through the replacement of Homo sapiens with these artificial beings. So don't be fooled. The people shouting the loudest about avoiding human extinction actually don't care at all about whether Homo sapiens exists beyond, say, the next few decades. How does this make sense? So they're screaming about the importance of avoiding human extinction, but here I'm claiming that actually they really don't care about human extinction at all, or they advocate for human extinction, because they define humanity in a very idiosyncratic and I would say quite sneaky way. It includes not just our species, Homo sapiens, but whatever successors we might have, including those who are entirely non-biological in nature. So an implication of this is that our species could literally die out in 10 years without human extinction. Without human extinction having occurred. So long as our disappearance coincides with the emergence of a new successor species of intelligent beings with, according to some, like Will McCaskill, that these various criteria for future beings to count as human, at least comparable moral status as us. In this scenario, human extinction doesn't happen, even though Homo sapiens disappears. This might happen it could potentially happen in the very near future. They would be, all of them would at least be okay with that. Many of them would be excited if this were to happen. So, relatedly, some might argue that utopia is an inherently exclusionary idea. Someone is always left out. If there are non-believers in the Christian heaven, then it's not heaven. If they're capitalists in the Marxist utopia, it's not utopia. So who exactly is left out of the utopia envisioned by long-termists? My argument is that most of humanity, perhaps even humanity itself, as we typically understand that term as denoting our species, almost certainly wouldn't survive, much less flourish in such a world. Another way to put this is consider AGI. If the long-termist doomers, like Yudkowsky, are right and the default outcome of a misaligned AGI is total annihilation, and if we build a misaligned AGI, then all of humanity loses because everyone dies. But if the long-termists manage to create an aligned AGI that as such realizes their utopia, then most, if not all of humanity loses. For at least most of humanity, then, this is a lose-lose situation, WTF. All right, so these criticisms can basically be placed in two categories: dangers of the pursuit of utopia and dangers associated with the realization of utopia. I know I'm pretty much out of time, which is convenient because I'm at the very end here. So then maybe I will skip over the just a few slides on Tescrealism and the collaboration with Dr. Timney Gebru, who discovered some of my writings, and something clicked and she realized that the changes she had seen within the field of AI are the result, at least in large part, of the growing influence of these ideologies. So that led us to write this article together in which we present the Tescreal framework, which seems for some reason to be useful to some scholars out there in critiquing these ideologies. And yes, so the other thing about the Tescreal concept, this is the last point I'll make, is that it underlines the fact that these ideologies, this bundle of ideologies, have become enormously influential in the world today. As I've said before, the world is full of bizarre, strange, weird, peculiar, odd, fanatical, extremist, and potentially dangerous ideologies. Most of these ideologies are not worth critiquing precisely because they have no appreciable influence in the world. That's not the case with the Tescreal bundle. The Techno-Utopian fantasies, the heart of the Tescreal bundle, have played an integral role in launching, sustaining, and accelerating the race to build AGI. And this race has already changed the world that we live in, for example, ChatGPT, and hence these Tescreal ideologies, by virtue of their influence on the AGI race, have already changed the world that we live in. So we need a counter movement. I don't really have any good ideas for how to actually do this. That's the point of my current research, trying to devise effective strategies for countering the influence of Tescreal ideologies. And so, yes, I'll end with that. Thank you very much. Yes.
We're, am I on? Is this on? Yeah, this one's on. Okay. That was fabulous. And I have to admit, I really wanted Emil to tell Emil's own story. So I'm really grateful to you for doing that. We're a little bit over time at the moment, but I think it would be a real shame not to take a couple of questions. So we have until 2 for lunch, which is here in the room with us. But if you could keep questions short, it would be great if those of you who do have questions for Emil want to raise them. I see 3. I'll take them. Lena?
Yeah, so I found it really interesting that you talked initially about eschatology and sort of this question of salvation. And I was wondering a little bit about the difference, because, if you think about the talks from last night, and then Professor Mitchell's talk, like, there is a notion of salvation there too, but maybe it's more soteriological rather than eschatological. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about if you see it in that sense, or if that's like a helpful way to think about it, the difference between those two notions. Does that make sense?
It does. I think I would need to reflect on that a bit more. There is a soteriological aspect. One thing that comes to mind is a book that was published, I guess, maybe 2 years ago by Thomas Moynihan. And the subtitle is How Humanity Discovered Its Own Extinction, something like that. And this idea of eschatology and soteriology are pretty prominent. And he is a diehard long-termist himself. So he sort of says the quiet part out loud when he's talking about the connections between religion and long-termism and so on. Great question. Maybe we'll talk after. Yeah, great. I'm really sorry for going over.
I know I have Douglas and Amitav. Was there another question right here? I'm going to take 3. Chen, I'm sorry. I'll bring you up after. Douglas first. We'll bundle them together and then let Emil answer them all.
Yeah. It's interesting. This comes in cycles. So for me, the realization was more in 1991, 92, right? When we realized that sort of the rave psychedelic Terence McKenna moved through the strange attractor at the end of time wasn't going to work. So it's interesting to see. It seems to come in waves. What I was wondering as you were speaking is it possible, and then this is optimistic, is it possible that the lame brain philosophies and religions of these technologists may be independent of the technologies themselves? And so that we can get AI without getting Kurzweil.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Joel from the Facility. I have just a brief question for you. What do you make of the lack of interest that Tescrealists have with ecological risks compared to AI risks?
Amitav?
So a lot of I gather a lot of the work that's being done on AI is now happening in India and China. Is there a substantive difference in their approaches?
So, great, excellent. Thank you so much. Wonderful questions. Tech without the ideologies. So my sense is that, yes, sure. I mean, a lot of people in the AI ethics community who are fiercely opposed to these ideologies are also very much pro-tech, right? It's Timmy Cabrew, and I don't want to speak for them, but my understanding is, Emily Bender and all of these other notable figures are like really pro-technology. I might be a bit of an exception because I'm more of a Luddite than a lot of these other individuals. Martin Rees describes himself as a political pessimist, technological optimist, and I feel like I'm a political pessimist and a technological pessimist. But yeah, I mean, in fact, I believe some people in this community would argue that, though, as a matter of contingent fact, the current race to build AGI did emerge from the Tescreal movement. It's entirely possible. So, counterfactually, if the Tescreal movement never existed, we may still be pursuing some kind of, general purpose algorithm. But perhaps the underlying ideologies would be quite different. So, I don't really see any tension in this idea that maybe we could keep the technology or something resembling the technology that we're creating, but combine it with a different set of ideological worldviews. But I'd be really curious to know what your thoughts are, so we'll talk later. As for the ecological risks, yes, on the one hand, I think Audra's talk really touched on this. The climate catastrophe, the massive biodiversity loss, the 6 mass extinction events, so on, all of these are catastrophes that aren't going to affect directly the super wealthy people in the long-termist movement or the tech billionaires who are exponents of this ideology. And so that, on the one hand, that inclines them to be less concerned about those risks. But on the other hand, there is an idea which is somewhat prevalent in these communities that I think arising from a utilitarian kind of axiology. We need to maximize well-being, minimize. One way to do that would be to minimize suffering. That there is a lot of suffering in the natural world, right? So there's a large number of wild animals. There's predation, parasitism, and so on. And so consequently, it could be the case that our destruction of the natural world is net positive, right? So this is not really a fringe idea among these individuals. Will MacAskill, in his book from 2 years ago, What We Owe the Future, says that there's a really good case to make that our obliteration of the biosphere is net good, because the fewer wild animals there are, the less wild animals suffering. So, yes, Amitov, yeah. And so, I've been asked this on a few occasions, and my answer is I honestly don't really know. I'm mostly familiar with the communities and the ideologies relating to Tescrealism within the U.S. Even there are like reporters in Europe who've asked about this, and like as far as I know, there's basically no real presence presence of transhumanism or long-termism in Germany, Portugal, France, and so on. So as for India, I kind of don't know, but I'm really curious. My sense is that there aren't many people in China and India who are like that conversant with these ideologies, and hence there aren't that many people who are motivated by this particular Techno-Utopian vision. But I could be wrong about that. So great question, though. Yeah. Thank you so much.